Hello and welcome to this episode of Ways to Change Your Workplace with myself, Prina Shah. And I'm very happy to introduce you today to my guest, Malini Jayaganesh, who is from Victoria in Australia. Now, Malini, welcome. It's so good to have you here today.
Thank you, Prina. I'm really excited to be here on your podcast.
Thank you. Malini, I've got a little bit of an introduction to you. You have many an accolade, so this is one that I'm going to read out, if you're okay with that. For our audience who are listening, Malini, I want to tell them all about you. So Malini Jayaganesh specializes in nurturing high-performing cross-functional teams. She was featured in the global list of top business relationship managers in 2019 and 2020. She has received 5 Global Excellence Awards from the Business Relationship Management Institute, as well as Service Excellence Award from the Department of Health and Human Services in Victoria. Malini is a specialist in all things business relationship management, which is what I'm talking to her today about. The title of this podcast is Become Better at Stakeholder Management. So Malini, that's the intro to you. But in terms of introducing yourself, welcome. And I'd love to learn a little bit more about yourself, what you do, why you do it, and how you got to where you are. First off, please, Malini.
Okay, Prina, that's actually quite a loaded question. So, in terms of where I am from, as some of your viewers or listeners may have guessed, I grew up in India, so I'm from the subcontinent. I also did my high schooling in Singapore. And I came to Australia as a young adult, and I've been here for about 27 years. So, Melbourne is home now. And my career has spanned things like business process improvement, business analyst, project manager, and of course, in recent years, it's been all about business relationship management. And as to the second part of your question, which is what has inspired me to do what I do, I have a little story to share with you. So quite early on in my career, I was involved. I had the opportunity to be part of a project, and my own role in that project was somewhat peripheral, right? But there were 6 main sort of players in that project. They were the decision makers and so on, and they were all senior members of the organization. And the way I would, retrospectively, when I think about it, the way it played out was they had gathered together to bake a pie, right? And each person had one unique ingredient that they brought. So one person had flour, another person had apples, another person had sugar, etc. Right?
Yeah.
And so the idea was they would bring all this together, bake a pie, and then divide it into 6 portions, and each person would get a slice, right?
Yeah.
But what I saw happening was that each person would put in only enough ingredients for 1 slice of the pie, because that's all they were going to get out of it.
Yes.
So the person with apples, instead of putting in 3 apples, would only put in half an apple, because that's what they were going to get. And so on and so forth. So, let alone a pie, we hardly ended up with a pancake. Right?
Yeah.
And from the very beginning, because I was there mainly to observe and learn, from day one, I had this feeling that this was going to be a disaster, right? And it was very disappointing, but a key learning that I had from that whole experience was how much distrust there was, how much unwillingness to share. There was, everybody was just focused on, their wedge of the pie rather than a shared outcome for everyone, right? And it made me realize, and I was, it was a very disappointing experience, but I'm glad I had that experience early in my career, because it highlighted to me that if we can actually address relationships and relationship issues, it can actually have far-reaching positive outcomes in the organization. And hence, over the years, I've actually focused more and more on nurturing relationships, within teams, within cross-functional teams, and so on.
Got you. Oh my gosh, what a beautiful analogy as well about the apple pie and the, pieces of pie. So Malini, a lot of the organizations that I support them through organizational culture optimization and culture change, let's say. And hearing your story about, the apple pie, I'm hearing about silos, about lack of communication. I'm now hearing about, I'm creating my own little culture here. You create your own culture there. I'm hearing now also about patch mentality. I'm protecting my piece of work potentially as well. And these are all the kind of things that I deal with from, the work that I do. But that's why I'm really pleased to be talking to you today, because I think business relationships or stakeholder management really closely links in to organizational culture, good culture or bad culture. And that's, up to the organization how these relationships are managed and nurtured as well within the organization. The more we work now, Malini, as well, again, linking back to your apple pie example, we work in hybrid teams. We work on virtual teams. We're working on different projects. So, you could be in Victoria, in Melbourne, where you are, and I'm in Perth, and we could still be in the same organization, but working together. Now, if we're talking about that apple pie concept in the modern, in the hybrid world, that's even more of a concern, because my apple pie is so far away from you and we're not even meeting in person anymore. I've got lots of questions for you now. Okay, let's talk about first basics. What is, from your perspective, relationship management 101?
I think there's a lot to it, right?
Yeah.
But if I were to just pick, we could be here forever, Prina, but if I were to just pick 2 or 3 things to highlight, right?
Yeah.
One is that, when we speak about organizational culture, right, there's different aspects to it, like processes, systems, etc. And people is one of those aspects. Yes. But it's people who actually make the culture, who determine what the culture is, right? So, and so the interactions between people, naturally, what we refer to as relationships, that's paramount.
Yeah.
And irrespective of, the mode in which relationships, or like people engage in relationships, so currently, for example, you and I are engaging in a virtual mode. Yes. That's just a channel, right? Yep. But what underpins our relationship is the respect we have for each other. Yeah. Our willingness to share what we know, right? Yeah. That comes like operating from a position of generosity, right? Like you've been kind enough to invite me to your podcast, Yeah. And that, like, I think that trust, empathy, those basic good values, right? Courtesy and things like that, irrespective of whether we are operating, in the same physical environment or in a hybrid environment or entirely virtually, those things don't change. Those things still form the foundation of good relationships, right? And that's what, those values actually contribute to relationship resilience. Yes. So if you think about the longer term, where we have a relationship based on mutual trust and respect, right? Yeah. If we encounter a glitch, right? Yeah. If something doesn't go, in the way that you would like it, you are more likely to give me the benefit of the doubt, right? Because you know me, you trust me, and you go, this is out of character for Malini, okay? Or maybe I haven't understood it. Let's have a conversation about it, right? Rather than jumping to the worst possible conclusion, and then, the relationship sort of spiraling downward from that. So I think these values, I would say, are what we have to keep at the center of good relationships.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So before, it's that know, like, and trust, so we have to build that that relationship between ourselves before anything else happens, from a, let's say, project perspective. Yeah, okay. When you were talking, I was writing about one line that you said, Malini, operating from a position of generosity. Oh my gosh. Now that really spoke out to me, because when we're talking about workplace cultures which are not so good, and we're talking about toxic teams or toxic workplace cultures, people are not operating from a position of generosity. People are operating from a position of me, and these are my KPIs and I have to meet them, not for that greater good of the organization. And I've seen many a time also where it's my agenda against yours, rather than that common goal that we have. And that's because of the fact that we don't have that operating from a position of generosity in our mindset, first and foremost. Also, okay.
You're absolutely right, Prina. And the thing is, if we want to sustain relationships from, for the longer term,
yeah,
generosity has to be there.
Yes.
It simply will not work if we have this, us and them kind of mentality.
Yeah. I remember, I think it's Stephen Covey who writes about relationships, and think of it like a piggy bank. You put money into a piggy bank, and sometimes you take money out. So you deposit and you withdraw from a relationship. You can't just keep on withdrawing. You'll be in deficit then. There'll be an issue. It's a two-way process, isn't it? Yeah. I play my part, you play your part, and we meet nicely, ideally in the middle. Yeah. Okay. So stakeholder engagement is a very important leadership skill to ensure that we manage change, that we develop our organizational cultures well as well. But it's still difficult for some to adapt to. Do you have any thoughts on this and any tips on this, please, Malini?
So I think, as someone who has, nurtured, teams through this relationship journey, where they start from the position of antagonistic relationships, this us and them kind of mentality. And I've sort of, as their manager, I've actually nurtured them to a place where they're able to work together, in a sustained way to achieve outcomes, right?
Yeah.
One of the things I focus on is defining performance measures that actually support collaboration. A lot of, in organizations, something that we see quite frequently, and Prina, you would know this, is that the performance measures that are used for individuals are actually geared towards encouraging individualistic behavior, rather than collectivist thinking.
Yeah.
Whereas if my performance measures, apart from things for myself, sort of like my own, learning and development and that sort of thing, that's one thing. And I might have some career aspirations that other people in my team might not have.
Yeah.
But there should be some measures in there that actually focus on how am I enabling other people to be successful. Only then, what they say, the rising tide lifts all boats.
Yes.
So we should, our performance measures are, sort of really drive our behaviors, right?
Yeah.
And it's a very simple way to bring that thinking, to shift the thinking. Oftentimes when I introduce performance measures that are team oriented, I get pushback, right?
Oh, okay.
I get pushback from staff who go, oh, why should I do this? And that person doesn't share this and that. And I say, well, try this out. And then in a few months, they actually, invariably, they say, I have never felt like I'm part of a team like this before, right? Wow. It creates that sense of belonging and shared purpose, that we are in this together. It completely changes the dynamics.
Yes. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. That's so good. I interviewed Professor Steve McKenna on an earlier episode on changing the way that we do performance and development plans. And oh my gosh, if you haven't listened to it, people need to go back and listen to that after they've tuned into this episode. But in that, he talks about just scrapping the whole system because of the fact that it is so individualistic. Mm-hmm. And we don't work in that manner within the workplace. We're all cross-functional. We're all, virtual teams, virtual projects of some sort or the other nowadays, right? Okay. One of the things I've also been supporting many a client on, Malini, and this talks to defining performance measures that enable collaboration, definitely so, is stepping back from that also, one step prior to that, step back and look at the team and their team brand. What do you stand for? What do you stand against? That's a really big one as well. Yeah. And that brings people together. But then the other question I ask, the teams that I'm supporting through the team brand sessions is, now, what is your stakeholder going to say about you? And what does the stakeholder actually think about you? Because what one says and what one thinks are often different things. So let's try and marry them. And that's one really important aspect. So when we're talking from a team perspective then, Malini, how do you enable teams to consider their stakeholder, whether it be internal or external stakeholders, in this whole relationship piece? Because that's a massive impact on our organizational culture there also.
You're right, Prina. And usually when, typically when teams do stakeholder analysis, right? Yeah. It's in the context of a particular project or program. Yep. So they would actually say, who are the key stakeholders? What sort of influence do they have? What sort of support are they willing to provide? How much, what's their level of buy-in for this initiative and so on.
Yes.
I actually like to change the time orientation, right? So what I say to not just to the teams that I'm leading, but also I deliver business relationship management training, right? So even in my training, what I say to people is that expand your time orientation so that it's not just about the project or program that's right in front of you, right? Think in the longer term. There'll be many projects, many programs that we have to work together on, right? So when you change your time orientation, your approach to the relationship will be different, right? It's sort of like the difference between a one-night stand and a marriage. I love this. To give you another analogy, right?
Yes.
When you're and I also would refer to Dory Clark's book, The Long Game, right? Yeah. All the suggestions she makes about how do we work towards that long game orientation as opposed to a shorter orientation, right?
Yeah.
So you need to, of course, you need to have empathy, trust, and all all the things that we have talked about earlier.
Correct.
But also the kind of milestones that you would set for yourself. The way that you might also be like you'd actually have to drop judgment about what people can and can't do. You might be more willing to experiment things. If something's not working, you go, okay, let's change that. You won't sort of think of it as a failure and this is the end of the road. You'll actually say, okay, let's try something else and let's see if we can keep on playing. So when we do stakeholder analysis, first and foremost, let's actually do it for the longer term relationship, right?
Yeah.
Right? And then these projects and things are all links in that chain.
Yeah.
And I think that actually completely reframes the situation for people.
Absolutely. I'm still processing it. And you've just dropped another beautiful analogy of a one-night stand versus a marriage in terms of that business stakeholder relationship management as well. And we need to absolutely focus on those longer-term marriage type of relationships that you refer to. And how fruitful would that be, if we did change our mindset from being like, let's just be honest, little robots working on this project, that project with a teeny weeny scope compared to that bigger picture thinking of, yes, while we are working on this project and these stakeholders, our longer term vision is this, and these are our stakeholders, and this is what we see, and this is how we're going to get there. So from an employee perspective and an organizational culture perspective as well, Malini, I imagine that there's far more buy-in from teams when they look at it from that long-term marriage perspective rather than that individual one-night stand perspective.
People progress to that understanding. Let me put it that way, because it's a culture shift, right? Yeah. So it's sometimes hard for people and also for leadership, organizational leadership to understand why it's important to reframe our approach, right? Yeah. But once they and the only way for them to really buy into it is to actually give that a go.
Yeah,
right? It's hard, I think it's hard to really appreciate the value of the long-term relationship if you've always been operating in a short-term mode, right?
Absolutely.
And you might think, oh, that's boring, it takes too long, it's not worth the effort, and so on. But when you start shifting your approach to relationships, you'll find that it gains the momentum of its own. To use one of Dory's metaphors, she says, look for the raindrops, right? Those little things that indications that things are actually progressing well. And those then sort of encourage you to continue in that mode, right?
Yeah.
When we adopt a longer term orientation to our relationships, we actually take time, like we invest time and effort in understanding the other parties better, right? Yes. We don't rush through it. We actually we try and understand what their imperatives are, what's the context within which they operate, and what their strengths are, what are the areas in which they actually need support, what are skills that I have that might complement what they bring to the table, and so on. So it's a beautiful it's a beautiful thing that unfolds.
Yeah, and time as well. Yeah, and I understand thinking about the response that you just gave, and I guess the barriers would be in relation to the fact, again, going back to our performance and development plans. If it's just for this quarter or for this financial year, that's my vision, tunnel vision, versus, oh my gosh, so we really need to rethink the way that we work in that respect, in the way that we allocate work to people, short-term, long-term. We can have different types of lengths of time of work, but from a relationship perspective especially, I think, you've given some really interesting insights as to that time perspective, single versus one night stand versus a marriage, and then the apple pie analogy as well. And I think for individuals who are tuning into this as well, what kind of advice or tips would you give them if they are looking to improve themselves as a recognized expert or a good relationship person? So in a workplace, you're not going to succeed if people don't know you. You need to build those relationships and nurture those relationships genuinely. That's the other big part as well. Yeah. Do you have any tips for people who are looking to improve relationships within the workplace in the respect that we're talking about?
That's a great question, Prina. So I had many learnings from that apple pie situation that I told you about, right? But two of them that I think is relevant, in the context of the question that you've just asked me. One is, I realized that that I didn't want to change my approach, right? Because one of the things that happened was I was quite naive, you can say. I actually was quite generous in sharing whatever I had the ability to share, right? And someone who was in a slightly more senior position actually appropriated that and used that to get promoted. And it was a disappointment for me, but on reflection, I thought, I'm not going to let that person's behavior change my attitude, because I have to live with myself. And I know that I'll only be able to do that if I continue to operate from that from a position of generosity.
Yes.
Right? And the second thing I also learned is that if I want to influence other people, I'm going to have to learn how to do that in a way that will capture their attention, right? And as a migrant woman of color, and generally being of the quieter sort, that was actually quite difficult.
Yeah.
And so I had to actually learn how to showcase what I'm trying to do, how to get comfortable with becoming visible or making myself visible. And also, looking for and finding people who are like-minded, because even if they're outside my organization, right, those relationships offer a lot of strength. Like our relationship, Prina, right? We're not actually working together on any project, right? But just the fact that we are friends, we know each other, and I can see you're doing things that I admire and would like to emulate, and there's mutual respect and so on. I draw a lot of strength from that.
Yeah.
So this is what I would say to anyone who's looking to take on more of a longer term relationship orientation, right? If in your immediate environment, if you find that the situation, is not particularly supportive, don't lose heart, right? Keep showing up and doing all the things that you need to do, right, to build your influence and visibility. At the same time, if you have to look, externally for support, and allies, do that.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, the world is open to that so much more now. Absolutely. Malini, you have shared so many gems. I'm going to put Malini's details in our show notes. So for anyone who wants to reach out to you, your details will be in there. Malini, I've got one final question for you. If I was to hand you a magic wand and say to you, what is one way that you could change the way of the workplace, what would it be?
I would actually ensure that organizations invest in nurturing leaders of a different kind. Right?
Yes.
I think the kind of leadership that is perceived as good leadership or typical leadership, I think it's time to change that, because that's the type of leadership that has led to the workplace cultures that we are seeing today.
Yep.
And there are many people with different views who show up differently. And I think organizations need to nurture that talent and give them a fair go.
Yes, absolutely. And again, it's looking at their systems and their beliefs of what a leader is as well. Nice. Yeah, completely agree with that. Malini, thank you so much for your time. I feel like I could talk to you for so much more, to be continued another time potentially.
Thank you, Prina. I've enjoyed this conversation and I look forward to catching up with you again.
My pleasure.